Morning all. How are we? Still alive, I hope. As usual, I'll deal with comments and questions and so on at the end. Take a moment to subscribe and click the little bell and select all while you're here. Let's see, housekeeping. About to lay out the second Gore Adventure release for this month. That'll probably take all day and possibly part of tomorrow. So yeah, looking forward to that. Layout and editing are the least fun parts of the process, especially since I still have to get a couple of art assets for this one. So there's that. Waiting on playtesting feedback on the Grimdark stuff, which a few people took. And then I can press ahead with Whitechester after that. Let's see, I've got a gig writing short stories, like 6 a month, so that's quite a lot of pressure. They let me do a half month this month since everything wasn't negotiated till then, so I'll be sending those off. I did my first tabletopless.org stream, so if you like porn and gaming mixed, you can go and watch that. Don't worry, I don't get naked, so you're fine there. It's been a weird backlash on that. Had a few people be very nasty anonymously towards me. A few people cut me off. Why that would happen, I don't exactly know. I've always been a bit of a libertine, so I don't quite understand the reaction. But I'm not gonna back off from doing it. I think it's a useful thing to do for the hobby. I think it's fun. I think it's different. I've always injected a note of sexuality, at least into games that I've written. So I don't know. I'm not cutting corners or doing anything less than I normally would for a game. It's just the themes are different, and I will be producing material in and around that game to sell, and you will be able to potentially get free temporary memberships to the site from that. I should be running another session on Friday. A permanent slot has opened up in the Dragon Warriors game that I've been running on this channel, so if anyone's free on a Tuesday and a Saturday, or one or the other, about 7:30 PM UK time, which is about 2:30 Eastern Standard, I think, let me know there. Yeah, pretty busy lately, which is a good thing, but also a lot of pressure. Alright, let's get into the news, shall we? There's been a cluster of stories about, is the coronavirus a chance to change the world, reset the world, do things differently to how we've otherwise always done? And I've mentioned this myself previously a few times in talking about the knock-on effect of the Black Death, in that it resulted in a much fairer, more equitable society, though obviously it still had a very long way to go. Now, I do think that the coronavirus and Trump and Brexit have shown a lot of problems in our current societies, particularly in the UK and the US, and there is an opportunity there to do things. Obviously, coronavirus isn't as deadly or as world-shaking as the Black Death was, but it is still an opportunity. We've seen how the reduction in traffic and industry has caused nature to bounce back very, very rapidly. We've also seen how social tensions get cranked up. We've seen that already with Trump and Brexit, but we saw that accelerated with the coronavirus and the discontent that leads to on all political wings. And the protests that we've seen, which are a bad idea on both counts, however righteous the cause. As a result, we're almost certainly going to see even more spikes in infections, and unfortunately with the With the Black Lives Matter protest, that's going to affect a community that was already being disproportionately affected. Not because of racism, obviously viruses aren't racist, but just because of peculiarities and differences in social demographics. In other countries, like for example France, they've massively expanded the bike lanes to make more space and more room for people to commute while retaining social distancing and to go out and get their allotment of exercise. Other countries haven't been so up on that. We've seen Germany bring in its disease tracking app and disease information sharing and so on, which is useful but raises questions of privacy. But we've also seen other countries like the UK completely fail on that score to even complete an app and get it working in any sort of orderly amount of time. We've also seen more and more people have been able to work from home using fast internet and being able to log into office systems remotely. And so the question is bound to arise, why do I need to commute? Why do I need to face all that stress and spend all that money when I could just continue working from home, only coming into the office when necessary? I think that if companies also understand that it can save them money and it makes things easier on their employees and it often leads to increased productivity, I think if companies realise that and understand that and aren't too old-fashioned, I think we're going to see a boom in home working. But that's going to place an increased amount of stress over the long term on the computer networks and the internet. And so we're going to have to really invest in that. Hopefully we'd see some private investment in that. Otherwise, I think it's going to become quite an interesting political issue. Along with that, I think we've also seen that the idea of internet access as utility has definitely crept up in people's consciousness, as have things like universal income and so on, which are being at least temporarily experimented with. But if we understand the internet as being a utility and something that perhaps we need to have a right to, like water or electricity, particularly when it comes to education, right? Then that could lead to a revolution in the way we even view the internet and consumer rights and personal rights and protections on there. So that'll be interesting to see how that all ends up playing out. But it's education where it's become most obvious, because with schools unable to convene, a lot of classes and homework and everything have been done online, but there are still people at the poor end of the spectrum or the more rural end of the spectrum who haven't been able to access those resources, who haven't been able to continue in education in this period. So the importance of the internet when it comes to education and homework and so on has suddenly, again, leapt up in people's consciousness, and many governments have moved to provide internet for poorer households and more remote households and so on. So hopefully that's something we can see continue. So it feels to me like the probable social changes that we're going to see are going to be around the world of work, around the idea that this is an opportunity to further green the systems that we use, and around education and our perception of the internet. But a lot of people, a sizable chunk of people, just want to go back to the status quo. And that is a very powerful force of inertia. So I think we need to consider that. But it's just interesting the way people are looking at this and considering things that might change and how they might change. Speaking of apps, so the UK was trialling an app on the Isle of Wight, but it never really got sufficient uptake to be useful. They wanted to develop their own, but as anyone who's ever worked in an office knows, getting the boss's kid or cousin or whatever to do the website for you rarely works out for anybody. It rarely works out as being as economical or useful as it might otherwise be. And they seem to be lying about it by saying that they were working closely with Apple and Google, who have denied knowledge of this. But it looks like we're going to rapidly and in a bit of a panic shift what app we're going to use. Why we did our own, I don't know. I think Some of it's to do with seeking profit. I think some of it's to do with cronyism, wanting to give contracts to friends, and money to friends. A lot of it's political, not wanting to be seen to be tied to Europe or tied to the tech companies, which is a bit more understandable. But it's been an omnishambles, a catastrophe, along with most everything to do with the coronavirus epidemic, unfortunately, in this country. It's supposed to be a contact tracer, so that it keeps track of who you've been near using anonymized data, by phones, just basically pinging each other as you're moving around. And then that would then enable contact tracing and to order people into isolation and so on, and to test them, and so you can get close to real-time tracking of the spread of the virus. But you need a large uptake on the app, and there were security concerns. There still are security concerns, and all these other issues. And just like Cummings, flouting the rules has eroded people's confidence and the amount that they even believe in the idea of social distancing and all the rest of it. I think this has ruined people's trust in any potential app that does come along, so the uptake is likely to be lower due to what's happened here, and mishandled again. There was a stabbing attack in Reading. Details are massively unclear. Still, at this point, the person who did the stabbings was known to security services, but that doesn't mean that necessarily had anything to do with it. It happened after a BLM protest, but again, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it, other than providing a target of opportunity. Got friends in Reading, spent a lot of time in Reading. They're all okay. But it's whenever something like this happens, it ends up being used almost straight away. I mean, the assumption is always that it's some kind of terrorist attack when it's a mass stabbing. We don't know that yet. People took the opportunity to attack what's her name, Ash Sarkar, the woman who's like, "I'm a communist, you idiot," because there's a photo of her sucking a lolly that somehow has something to do with this. I'm not entirely sure how. And the usual suspects use it to bang on about immigrants and Islam and all the rest of it, though we don't know all the details. You should always wait a couple of days to find out what the hell it's all about. One of the victims was a teacher who doesn't seem to have been involved in any protest or anything, just seems to be a well-liked guy. Who bloody knows? Police did respond and catch the fellow, but there's just no real details yet. So anyone telling you anything doesn't really know what's going on. So I guess I'm just here to tell you that nobody knows what's going on, and that includes me. So wait, probably a couple more days to get any actual useful details out of it. Brits, we love our tea, except for me, I don't like tea or coffee, and we love our pubs, except for me, I don't much care for our pubs either. But Brits in general, rather than on an individual basis, love tea and love pubs. And the Prime Minister is to announce on Tuesday, so tomorrow, if pubs can reopen in the UK. We've already had messages from our local pubs saying, we're waiting to hear, but if we get the go-ahead, this is how we're going to do things. And they already have been providing delivered meals and delivered alcohol for some time, which was quite enterprising of them, I thought. But yeah, it looks like they're going to reopen at any point soon. So, is this a good thing? I don't know that it is. It seems premature. They seem to be ignoring all their own usual guidelines and the alert status levels that they've suggested. And if the pubs do reopen and people flood back to them, which they probably will do, and if they've reduced the distancing to 1 metre, which lessens the effect of social distancing on retarding the virus, it doesn't seem like a very sensible thing to do. It seems very premature. I don't want pubs to go under. I don't want them to close. They're often sort of social hubs of villages and areas and so on around the country. But people's safety has to come first, and we are like the worst in Europe, worse than the rest of Europe combined when it comes to casualties and infections and so on. And the reality of it is that the deaths and so on are probably about twice as bad as the official statistics, so you have to consider that as well. So it just seems utterly premature. It's almost as if they're going ahead with their herd immunity plan, regardless. So if I were you, I would not go to the pub yet. I would wait. But no one's going to listen to me, and not enough people watch. So there you go. There's a recent-ish scandal before we were hit by coronavirus and Black Lives Matter protests and all the rest of it, perhaps feeding into the BLM protests here in the UK. But there was a big scandal where a lot of West Indian immigrants who came to the UK in the 50s and 60s were being forced to undergo a great deal of immigration scrutiny. And obviously, this being so many decades ago and life being as hectic as it is, a lot of them didn't necessarily have all the paperwork that they were supposed to have, that they were demanded to have, from what was a very different immigration issue and process back in the 50s and 60s. So this was the Windrush scandal, and it looks like we're about to revisit it. Because the government's about to do another sort of round of immigration checks and all the rest of it, probably to do with Brexit, but it's likely to sweep up people who were involved in Windrush. Now, these are West Indian immigrants who used to be part of Empire, which used to give them the right of settlement to come here, who came here decades ago, who've had children here, who've worked jobs here for decades, and they're just being treated as if they were brand new immigrants here in the UK and expected to have all this paperwork and so on. This was a scandal. Recommendations were made. Those recommendations have not been implemented, so we're probably likely to see another round of problems here, but we're also likely to see that obfuscated by the UK failing to extend the transition period on Brexit, which is going to be a huge scandal. Coronavirus is going to continue to be a huge scandal and dominate the headlines. This is less likely to get much attention. So, I mean, I don't know what you can really do about it, other than just say we shouldn't be checking. Right? It's a waste of time and resources. To people whose parents and grandparents might be under threat, tell them to get their papers in order, I guess, as best they can, or to be forewarned and forearmed and ready for a fight, and to get hold of charities and so on that will help and support them with the process. But we seem to be moving to a far darker, nastier, more insular, more xenophobic Britain. And even with the catastrophes ongoing in government, I don't think it's likely that we're going to dislodge the Johnson government, probably not at the next election. So we're looking at a decade minus time served of the worst excesses of Tory government, unfortunately, barring a miracle. We really need electoral reform, but that's a whole other ball of wax. Okay. South America is not doing particularly well when it comes to the coronavirus. A few nations notwithstanding, but they tend to be kind of backwaters, low population. And the other issue is that a lot of governments in South America aren't necessarily particularly forthcoming with their information. I have a contact in medicine in Brazil who can confirm that it's really bad there. They've just passed 50,000 deaths. From what they tell me, the hospitals are completely rammed and overloaded, and there's a lot of people who can't even make it to the hospitals, people living in the favelas and so on. So there's a huge amount of deaths and infections in Brazil that aren't even going recorded or noticed or treated at all. So yeah, it's horrible. South America looks to be the next big spike of infections and problems, and I suspect even the more backwater countries that have been coping reasonably well with lower level measures are going to get hit just due to the sheer scale of the problem in Brazil spreading to other countries. So yeah, and a big part of the problem there, just as in the UK and the US, is that they have a right wing populist government who refuse to take it seriously. Bolsonaro is fucking horrible. Hi Adam. Yeah, just make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell, and I'll get to comments in a bit. So Germany's response to the coronavirus has been pretty good. They got things under control. Some of their measures might seem to be a little heavy-handed to some people. They've quarantined a tower block in Göttingen. That sounds more Dutch. Göttingen, I guess. Goet. Göttingen. Anyway, they've quarantined an entire tower block where the virus has been sort of making its way through the residents there. So out of a tower block of about 700 people, I think, 700 people in quarantine, 120 of which have been found to be infected. Most of the people living in there have been complying with the quarantine and the testing and so on, but a subset of people, about 200, tried to break out. They fired fireworks at police and have done other things, which obviously is a bad idea. You don't want the infection to spread to any of the surrounding buildings, and tower blocks and so on are particularly vulnerable due to recycled air and people living in very close proximity and shared general areas like hallways and stairways and so on. But they've had to bring in more police to maintain the blockade on the block and stop people getting out, unfortunately. Now that can seem heavy-handed, but we're talking about a deadly infection. All right, imagine if it was zombies. Okay, you want to maintain the quarantine on the tower block. You want to take out or contain the zombies. You don't want to let anyone out because the threat to everyone else is there, right? It's not zombies, obviously. It's not the Black Death, obviously. But this is a built-up area with other tower blocks that could get infected, and then that could get out of hand. So the heavy-handedness is justified so long as it's temporary. So a society can only be as liberal as it can afford to be, and that's both monetarily and in terms of other social issues. So people complaining about totalitarianism and authoritarianism and so on, if they don't let go of these emergency powers once the crisis is definitively over, then you can start protesting and bitching. But we are talking about a deadly pandemic. So doing things like this, forcibly quarantining blocks, provided they take care of the people who are inside, is completely justified. We were talking earlier about the Windrush thing, and I did a video on this recently, but the key to unlocking my understanding of what people mean when they say systemic racism was understanding that it's not racism. What they mean is the effect of policies disproportionately affects a certain sector of the community. So the Windrush issue, for example, is probably an unintended, knowing this government, who knows, probably an unintended effect of a tightening of immigration restrictions, right? So you tighten immigration restrictions, obviously it's going to disproportionately affect people who are more obviously foreign, I guess, in one sense, and people who are immigrants, and most of those immigrants are not going to be, white-skinned, perfect English-speaking British people. So the outcome of a policy that is otherwise race-neutral can more affect people of a certain race. To me, this is more obviously classism, and it's being conflated with race because, well, in Britain's case, more immigrants are going to be of ethnic minorities, and they're starting from nothing in a new country, so they necessarily start out poor. And our social mobility, while better than that of the US, due to what's left of our welfare state and so on, and public education system, it's still pretty bad. It's hard to be not poor. It's hard to break out of that and to socially climb compared to, say, Finland or Norway or Denmark or something, which are far more socially mobile due to their high levels of social investment. But at least here in Britain, we're more aware of class as an issue. The coronavirus is affecting the poor the worst, people who have been living precariously, the precariat, right, as it's been called, people involved in the gig economy, or households that were on the edge, being unable to go out to work, being unable to get a salary, the 5-week wait to get on universal credit, and the lesser amount of money that you get from being on universal credit. All of these things that hit poorer households more, right? So more middle-class households are more likely to own their house, so at least they're always going to have a roof over their head, more likely to be able to work from home, more likely to be furloughed, more likely to be on proper contracts rather than 0-hour contracts or technically self-employed or whatever. So this means that policies that aren't necessarily intended to impact the poor can impact the poor more, right? In a similar way to policies that impact immigrants more, that impact racial minorities more, aren't necessarily intended to do so. So to understand systemic racism, understand that it's not racism, it's just the end effect, right? Nobody involved needs to actually hate brown people or whatever else. And similarly here, no one involved has to necessarily hate poor people for the policy to affect poor people more. So you could say this is systemic classism because it's not intended to. Nobody is deliberately picking on the poor, but policies and measures in place just affect them in worse ways. But this should have been obvious to anybody, and I think this is also part of what is disproportionately affecting black and minority ethnic communities. No one's setting out to do it, right? And it's important to understand that nobody involved need be racist or classist or either. It's just that the end result, the effect of the policies, hits them more. And I think using terms like systemic racism is singularly unhelpful because people think, well, no, this isn't a racist policy. No, I'm not being racist, and I agree with this. If you say, this disproportionately affects these communities, if you turn it around and say this is unfair, I think that's far more persuasive and useful to people, whether you're talking about class, whether you're talking about race, whether you're talking about sexuality or gender. I think you get a lot further making the argument for equality and fairness than you do by accusing people of being bigots. But hey, what do I know? On that further note, there's a report out on the managers of British companies and who are the kind of top bosses of companies. Who did this study? Because it's useful to actually say who did it. It's a charity called Business in the Community, which has campaigned for workplace racial equality for 25 years. Okay. So they have certain biases, so you should always take that into account and take the results with a pinch of salt. But still, they report that just 1.5% of top bosses at UK companies are black, which compares to 3% of the population of England and Wales. All right, so this ties into some of the things we were just saying. Do we really think that this is because of racism? Probably not. So if we just look at the percentage of the population, right, it's 3%. And if everything was entirely equal, we would therefore expect 3% of the top bosses at UK companies to be black. But that's not the case, right? We're a majority white country, and the black population has a disproportionate amount of immigrants who are starting from the bottom, so you wouldn't expect them to necessarily have the same level of education or the same amount of opportunity. Social mobility is pretty poor in this country, and even though it's been a couple of generations since that big influx from the West Indies, you wouldn't necessarily expect them, because of that, to have been able to climb out of that lower level, poorer state of living. And a lot of the black minority ethnic community is concentrated in the big cities, particularly London, where living costs are high, so you've got less money free to invest in things like education. So just a bald comparison of population density, population amount, doesn't tell you anything, really. You have to take the whole context into account, and it doesn't have to be racism, but the implicit or explicit charge is always that there is some kind of racial animus going on that's preventing people from succeeding. Now, don't get me wrong, that's probably part of the problem, but the vast and overwhelming majority of the problem, I think, can be fairly easily pointed at as being higher rates of poverty, higher rates of immigration. All of these kind of things stand against someone before you even get to the issue of race. And a lot of the reasons are perfectly understandable, justifiable to an extent, and help you understand the whole level, the whole thing, right? So to suggest that it's racism, even systemic racism, though I guess you could argue that it's that, but would you really expect a working class Polish man coming to the UK to immediately step in and be the top boss of a large company? You wouldn't expect that either, right? But he'd be counted as ethnically white coming into the UK. These things are complicated, and yet everyone on every side of the argument seems to be trying to push extremely simplistic and unforgiving arguments, and that's massively unhelpful. But that just seemed to tie some of these other stories together. The government and various quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations, is just what that stands for, they're starting to get attention from select committees and watchdogs and so on. This is probably going to be a slow-rolling scandal over the next few years, but it's nice to see that some scrutiny is finally being levelled on the government for its fuck-ups around the coronavirus. Starting with PPE equipment. A lot of money was spent on PPE equipment that didn't meet standards. It was essentially useless. Or so some of the stuff that came from China wasn't up to code, wasn't N95, that was useless. A bunch of aprons and things that came from Turkey weren't to NHS standards, weren't actually useful in protecting anyone. There's a lot of this going on. So it's nice to see some scrutiny beginning, and hopefully some people will finally be held to account over a lot of this. Katie Hopkins has been permanently suspended from Twitter. She's if you don't know who she is a very, very right-wing and increasingly right-wing as she gets continuously victimised and pushed off platforms. She's a right-wing spreader of vitriol, has some very, very nasty viewpoints, or at least expresses them to please her audience. So she's been finally permanently suspended from Twitter. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. A lot of people get suspended from Twitter who don't deserve it. I've had an account permanently suspended from Twitter for disagreeing with a washed-up ex-Star Trek actor. She has said a lot of horrible things that do go against terms of service. No one's entirely sure what she actually said this time that would do it. It may have been participation in Whiteout Wednesday, which was a sort of counter protest to a lot of the BLM blacking out social media screens. But yeah, she's been permanently suspended. On the one hand, like I say, good, she's a horrible bigot. On the other hand, bad, because it feeds into the oppression narrative that the right-wing types tend to form around themselves, that they're being censored, and they are, to be fair. Right, I need to take a break for a second. I will be right back. Please type in any comments or questions. I will get to them at the end. I will be right back, so if anyone new turns up, let them know. Sorry about that. I seem to have picked up a nausea reaction to some of my medication, so no one wants to hear me gag. So I thought I'd better pop off. Right. Some more positive science news. We've now mapped about 1/5 of the Earth's entire ocean floor, which is interesting. Not to a particularly high resolution, of course, and we still have a huge amount left to map. I think what's still unknown is about equal to the surface of Mars, about which we know more than we do about our own planet in some ways. But it's interesting. This is like the last great unexplored region of our planet is the deep ocean. So it's good to know. So we were at about 19%, very close to 20. But there's so much more to know, and there's all kinds of strange and stunning life down there. So maybe once we're done mapping, we can identify some interesting underwater areas for further exploration and understanding of biodiversity. And once we understand the sort of deep sea climate around some of these deep underwater mountains and ranges and microclimates, these are good places for exploration. And of course, there's also all kinds of novel bacteria and plants and sponges and fish and so on, which could be useful sources for medication, antibiotics. Finding out natural ways that these creatures deal with their environment can greatly boost our understandings of bioscience. So in the long term, this could be a very interesting and useful thing. Greta Thunberg had a recent interview. I know a lot of you are rolling your eyes already. Her big thing is climate change. But she's been kind of sidelined by other issues that are going on. But I watched an interesting interview last night with a science communicator whose speciality is sort of debunking climate change denial. I think the channel I watched on was called A Second Thought or A Second Thought. It's a kind of science education channel, a little bit more amateurish than some of them, but he does interview some interesting people. And he was making a useful point, this scientist that was being interviewed, about how we're hardwired, how we're evolutionarily hardwired to react to imminent threats and dangers and problems. And there's a lot of truth to that. Whereas climate change is a confluence of many different factors, none of which are necessarily immediate. So it's a bit of a apt analogy, the boiled frog thing, which isn't true, but it's still useful as an analogy, even though it perpetuates a sort of a wrong idea. So it's been hard to get people to act on climate change because it feels remote and a lot of it is opaque. Now, as natural disasters ramp up in frequency and severity, that might change because those are more immediate. If we can get people to understand that that's got a lot to do with climate change. But little wonder that the news cycle has fixated upon a more immediate problem, coronavirus, and then that has faded into the background as they've fixated upon other, even more immediate problems, such as riots and protests and destruction and so on. It's just that's the way our psychology works, and it takes an active amount of effort to take threats in proportion. Climate change is a bigger issue than riots. It's a bigger issue than coronavirus. But it's distant and it's hard to understand, and it's a confluence of different factors. So she's right when she says climate change is as urgent as coronavirus, but only in the sense that it's a much bigger problem, but it's slower rolling. But we still need to take action now, right? An analogy I've tried to use, but which doesn't work because it's also complicated, is threats to the Earth from asteroids. Right? If we detect an asteroid that is on a definite or very high percentage chance of collision with the Earth, the sooner we do something about it, the less we have to do. If you intercept such an asteroid with a satellite at a great distance, you can use that satellite as a gravity tractor and ever so slightly pull the thing off course. And of course, the further away it is, the smaller amount you have to change the course for it to miss us, right? As it gets closer, you have to consider more extreme actions, like using atomic explosions to push it off course, firing nukes at the thing, or various more Hollywood star solutions. But after it gets past a certain point, there's not really much of anything you can do, and then you get to the point of creating shelters or seed banks or terraforming the Earth or various other options, ways to come back from the catastrophe of being hit by an asteroid. But after a certain point, it's too late. But the sooner you act, the cheaper and easier the solutions are, and climate change is kind of the same. But unfortunately, solving one scientific problem with another scientific analogy doesn't tend to work. So I don't know. But she has a point, and it's nice to see at least some news sources addressing that. Also on coronavirus, a whole bunch of kids will be going back to school in September regardless. Again, like the pubs, probably not a good idea. I guess we'll see how bad things are by then. I mean, children are at lower risk, but there is a syndrome associated with coronavirus that is affecting some children, which results in multiple organ failure. Very rare, but it does happen. It does seem to be linked to coronavirus. So, I don't know. I'm guessing a lot of parents will not send their kids back to school at that time. Whether the government will be understanding of that remains to be seen. Lastly, I want to follow up on a story I did on my main channel, post-mortem video. Go subscribe, click on the bell, select all, do that here too. But Warren Ellis was recently kind of Me Too'd, bit of a whisper network thing. Apparently he's had some inappropriate relationships with some women, which they think is down to him using his power in the industry to seduce them or to have affairs with them. I said that I thought that didn't sound like him to me, and I kind of know him, and I know women who know him far better than I know him, and they seemed like, what? When it came down to this. It doesn't seem to have a great deal of substance to it, other than maybe he had some inappropriate relationships with some women, boosted their careers, but that doesn't seem to have been part of the dynamic necessarily, at least from his point of view. It was sad to see people like Laurie Penny, whose career he did help without apparently any payback, turning on him instantly because of the whole believe all women thing. Believe evidence, right? That's where you should start. And it does seem like he had some inappropriate relationships, but it doesn't particularly seem like any of them were exploitative, or any of the women involved were underage, or he did anything rapey. It just seems like, he's a powerful man in the comics industry, even though he doesn't necessarily see himself that way, and those women are recontextualizing what seems to have been a bad breakup, essentially, in light of that and in light of the whole new context of relationships and so on. But I said he would probably get out in front of this fairly quickly, and he would probably sort of give in to an extent and apologise for whatever happened, even if he didn't really do anything wrong, and that does seem to have been what he's done. So Warren Ellis is kind of important to me because I've worked with him, our social circles overlap, and his work's been very important to me. Probably second only to Alan Moore, and in terms of comics that have affected me or been important to me. So take that as you will. But here's his statement, and it is pretty much exactly what I said he would do, because he's always been fairly right on. So Warren Ellis says, "The recent statements have been made about me that need to be addressed. I've never considered myself famous or powerful, to the point where I've made a lot of bad jokes about it for 20-odd years. It had never really occurred to me that other people didn't see it the same way, that I was not engaging as an equal when gifted with attention, but acting from a position of power and privilege. I did not take that into account in a number of my personal interactions, and this was a mistake, and I own it. While I've made many bad choices in the past, and I've said a lot of wrong things, let me be clear. I have never consciously coerced, manipulated, or abused anyone, nor have I ever assaulted anyone. But I was ignorant of where I was operating from at a time I should have been clear, and for that I accept 100% responsibility. I hurt people deeply, I am ashamed for these mistakes, and I am profoundly sorry. I will not speak against other people's personal truths, and I will not expose them to the toxicity of the current discourse. I should have been more aware, more present, and more respectful of people's feelings, and for that I apologise. I've had friendships and relationships end, sometimes in bitterness, often due to my own failings, and I continue to regret and apologise for the pain I've caused. I've always tried to aid and support women in their lives and careers, but I've hurt many people that I had no intention of hurting. I am culpable. I take responsibility for my mistakes. I will do better, and for that I apologise. I apologise to my friends and collaborators for having created this situation, and I hope they will be treated kindly. Mistakes and poor choices in my personal life are not on them, but only on me. We have a responsibility to one another every day, and I have in my past let too many people down. I hope to one day become worthy of the trust and kindness that was placed in me by colleagues and friends. I will continue to listen, learn, and strive to be a better human being. I've sought to make amends with people as I have been made aware of my transgressions, and will continue to do so. I have apologised, I apologise, and will continue to apologise and take total responsibility for my actions without equivocation. I'm going to be quiet now to listen more than I speak, for other voices matter far more than my own right now. So he pretty much did exactly what I predicted he would do, which was to get out in front of it and apologise, even though he didn't really seem to have anything to apologise for. It's unfortunate in a lot of ways that he would just buckle under to accusations like this, but there is no winning move in this. And if he had taken a stand, it probably would have ruined his career, or increased the likelihood that his career was going to be ruined, and it probably already is to one extent or another. He's likely to get dropped from a bunch of places now, which is a shame, because he was starting to break into film and television and things where he would be properly rewarded for his work. What I find particularly interesting here is that Warren has not ever really considered himself to be particularly powerful. His social media presence has always been fairly powerful. He's been able to direct a lot of attention to people in the way that he did for Laurie Penny and so on. But he has never considered himself that way. He's very British in that he's extremely self-deprecating. As long as I've known him or known of him, he's always been pretty popular with the ladies in a way that he never particularly seemed that comfortable with or to understand. But it held out a lot of hope for other ageing bearded writers, certainly. So I believe him when he says he never considered his position in that way, because that's consistent with the way in which he conducted himself and the way he talked, and a certain kind of Britishness that I think I share with him. So this does seem to me to be misunderstanding and bad relationships, and you don't necessarily act in the most rational and sane way when you're attracted to someone. And if you are a giant nerd in the way that Ellis is, and you suddenly get a lot of popularity and soft power, as people call it, you don't necessarily internalize that. Your self-image doesn't necessarily reflect that. So while other people may have seen him as being powerful and using that power to coerce or control or whatever, I believe him 100% when he says, I never considered myself that way. So if you're going to take the personal perception, the subjective perception of what was going on from one side, surely you have to balance that with the subjective personal perception of the other side. Now, there's no talk of assault or underage or inappropriateness in that way in any of this. It all seems to have been between consenting adults. So really, where is the problem? We've all had bad breakups and bitterness, and we've all acted in stupid ways in those contexts, right? And we've all blundered and done terrible things not terrible. We've all blundered and done stupid things when we're attracted to people, right? So where exactly is the issue here? And it seems to be this disjunct in perception between self-perception and other people's perception of him. But he's done exactly what I said. It's probably the only move, other than not saying anything, that holds out any hope for him. I hope his career continues. He certainly doesn't seem to be as bad as a lot of people have been accused, but there you go. Anyway, I just wanted to follow up on that, and I didn't think it was worth a whole video. Alright, let's look at your comments. Make sure to type in any others or questions if you want me to get to them about anything, whether it's the news or me or whatever. Sonic says, in the Netherlands, they opened things up 3 weeks ago and have seen no peak/rise in COVID cases. Further, there was a demonstration for BLM and they recorded one suspected case. They're probably doing a lot better from all of this than many of us. I haven't followed the Netherlands in particular, so if you've got any insight, I guess that would be good to know. But I would imagine that some of the nearby German efficiency is rubbed off on the Netherlands, and I also suspect, knowing the Dutchies like I do, that they're fairly friendly to each other and have a stronger sense of community responsibility than perhaps the Brits do. So all of that will have helped keep it under control. Probably had slightly more warning than a lot of other people as well. So I suspect there's a lot of factors working into that. But it's interesting to hear about another country. Like, I know people in the States who are like, this country's fucked, and I know what things are like here. I've got a couple of friends in Germany who keep me clued in on what's going there. A couple of friends in Brazil who keep me clued in on what's going on there. It's just interesting to get kind of on the ground perceptions from people in different countries. So it's interesting to hear what you're saying. But here, I think we're screwed, and we're going to see a second wave very soon, I would think. But it's interesting. It's interesting to hear about other countries. Adam mentions that numbers in India are looking pretty concerning. Yes, but I'm not hearing that much out of India. I should probably go and do some more research on that. I suspect that just like in Brazil, the numbers that we're seeing are concentrated in the sort of the middle and upper class, and we're not necessarily seeing just how bad it is in the poorer communities. India is extremely highly populated in its urban areas, and there's a hell of a lot of poor people who aren't necessarily going to appear in the official statistics or be particularly worried about or concerned about, right? So I suspect it's, yeah, like Adam says, I suspect it's a massive undercount and things are a lot worse. This hasn't been helped by the Indian governmental response, which has included recommending things like homeopathy. Yeah. Cultural issues can be a big constituent part in all this. So, like, we're talking about Holland. I think there's probably a cultural difference in the Netherlands. In Amsterdam. Stop. This virus is not ready yet. I suspect there's a cultural difference between Holland and the UK and the US, in that the UK and the US are far more individualistic, which is why we saw the protests against the lockdown, and we see the ongoing protests against wearing masks and so on, even before all the BLM stuff. Whereas if you look at the other extreme, sort of passing by Holland and Germany and looking at the Scandinavian countries, they have a really strong community ethic where you're responsible to and for your neighbours and so on. And to an extent, that's the real reason Sweden, while being terrible for the Scandinavian countries, has done reasonably well on coronavirus, because there is that social cohesion and that sense of responsibility to each other, and a decent medical system and all the rest of it. So culture can have a really big effect. And in India, this culture of alternative medicine will not have helped at all. And in Africa, there's a quite strong anti-vaccination movement, not for any rational reason, but there just is. And that's probably going to cause problems down the line, right? So, yeah, culture can make a big difference. Adam asks, which Star Trek actor? It was Will Wheaton. So this was quite some time ago. This is my old main account, which I'd missed because it had like 5,000 followers and was a really useful outlet. But okay, so here's what happened. Will Wheaton was going on and on about how Twitter had turned toxic. And the comparison he used was like, it used to be this really cool nightclub, and then a bunch of Nazis showed up and made it really intolerable. And all I did was turn his analogy around and say that, okay, sure, but in this analogy, it's you and people like you who use social media as an excuse to police other people and report them and ban them and so on. You know, in that analogy, you and people like you would be the Nazi. But obviously, Will Wheaton had a pretty big account with lots of followers. And what seems to have happened was that a lot of people reported my tweet, even though it didn't break any rules, and that tripped some automated system that banned me, which certainly seems to be how it used to work, because people used to organise mass blockings in order to try and knock people off the platform, and it used to work. So I think something similar happened there in terms of malicious reporting from people who followed Will Wheaton's account. So that's what seems to have happened there. But yes, clearly a thin-skinned dick sponge. Adam, I presume, talking about Greta Thunberg, says her gap year is finished, so we're going to see less of her. Perhaps. I think once coronavirus fades away again, and perhaps once people start going back to work and the environment starts to get impacted again, maybe she'll come back. I think she's useful as a spokesperson, but as she gets older, she's going to be less useful as a spokesperson, because people sort of naturally react negatively when people criticize and attack a child or a teenager. But as she becomes an adult, that reaction's gonna lessen. Some people really hate her. Hard for me to judge why. She's just telling us what we need to know, really. She's an effective communicator, even if she doesn't have the academic chops. Apophis was a worry some years ago, says Adam. Looked like it'd smack Earth in the face in the 2030s. That now seems like it's almost certainly going to miss us. Yeah, and that's a good analogy for climate issues. Sonic says he'll get me some more info on COVID. Lol. No, I'm genuinely interested because I like being able to get sort of on the ground reporting from people in different countries. So I know people in Finland, Canada, America, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, but Germany, France, but I could always use more. And I am quite interested in how the Netherlands deals with it, because I think culturally, like we were talking about, they're kind of halfway between Germany and Scandinavia in terms of sort of laid-backness and community sort of understanding and care. Oh, for fuck's sake, magic water, says Adam. Yeah, homeopathy. It goes back to Ayurvedic medicine and energistic medicine. China and India both are heavily into their alternative medicine. So in some ways we're fortunate that there's a brutal communist regime in China because they don't have any time for that shit and believe in actual medicine. India, not so much. Adam also says, I was watching a speech from Carl Sagan yesterday, made in 1990, warning us of the climate change issues. 30 years on, still quite some number of people won't even accept it's happening. There's hope. This a Second Thought channel I was watching, the science educator he was talking to, whose name escapes me, he was saying that it is changing and shifting, and that now a majority of people are reasonably concerned about the issue. The problem is the deniers and the vested interests have a disproportionate amount of effect upon policy and upon the public discourse in media. And until and unless we can crack that problem, we're not really going to make a great deal of headway. I should probably get on. I've got a lot of layout to do today. So, yeah. Sagan stuff's all still worth reading. And he certainly had a way with words. I think Dawkins is his inheritor, but Dawkins is more combative. But if you read Dawkins' work, he has a similar gift for language to that Sagan had. It's in the debates and so on that he comes across more angrily. And I don't think we live in a time where even Sagan would do particularly well, because we live in an era where nuance isn't welcome. If you have a nuanced view on anything, you're going to get into trouble with both sides of any debate that you get involved in. Oh, that reminds me. One last piece of housekeeping. I'm going to be interviewed on I don't know how you pronounce the name, T Smith, her channel, on Thursday at around 9:30 a.m. She's a fairly radical feminist, I would say. Plenty of people would call her a TERF, I suppose. But she's trying to learn about things like Gamergate and the men's rights movement and things like that I've been either tertiarily how do you kind of involved in. tertiarily I'm gonna have to look that up. Things that I've been kind of involved in or adjacent to, so I'm hoping we can have a productive conversation, because the trans issue is one on which I have a nuanced position that gets me in trouble with both sides, and I'm hoping I can have a useful conversation with a fairly radical feminist on that and men's issues and other things. So we'll see, but I'll tweet that out or whatever in case you're interested in watching. That should be around 9:30 on Thursday. Right. Anyway, have a good one, everyone. Always nice to see you. Good luck with whatever you're doing today. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay away from each other, you plague-carrying scumbags. Bye.